The house was gone. The truck was gone. The 41 years of savings, the ones he had built quietly, carefully, the way a man builds a wall stone by stone without ever making a show of it, gone. What Earl Sutherland had left behind, after 32 years of marriage, could fit into the back seat of a 2009 Dodge that smelled of dog and old coffee, and something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was just the smell of starting over at 64. He didn't cry when he signed the papers. He didn't cry when Renata walked out of the lawyer's office without looking back, her heels clicking down the hallway like a sentence being read aloud. He sat in the parking lot of the law office on Renfrew Street for 22 minutes, with both hands on the steering wheel, the engine off, and Cooper's heavy head resting on his shoulder from the back seat. A Belgian Malinois, 8 years old, with a scar above his left eye from a training incident back at the base in Wainwright. Cooper had been with Earl through 2 tours, a medical discharge, 3 provinces, and now this. Earl finally started the engine. He drove north. He had nowhere else to go, and nowhere else felt right anyway. The cabin had belonged to his uncle, Bernard, who had died the previous November without a will and without children, and with the kind of stubborn solitude that runs in certain families like a second bloodline. Earl was the only living Sutherland left who had any claim to it, and he'd filed the paperwork from a motel room in Red Deer with the help of a paralegal who charged him $200, and a woman at the land registry office in Peace River who had been kind enough to explain everything twice. The cabin sat on 12 acres outside of Valley View, Alberta, on a gravel road that didn't appear on most maps and didn't want to. Earl had been there once, as a boy of maybe 11 or 12. He remembered the smell of pine and propane and something fried on a cast-iron pan. He remembered his uncle Bernard pointing out constellations through a gap in the spruce trees, naming them in a voice that sounded like it was used to being the only one talking for long stretches. He didn't remember much else. When he pulled off the highway and onto the gravel road, it was late April, and the mud was still thick enough to pull at the tires. Cooper sat up in the back seat, ears forward, reading the air through the cracked window. The dog had always done that. Processed the world before Earl could even identify what he was feeling. 8 years of that. 8 years of being known before he knew himself. The cabin came into view, around a long bend in the trees. Earl stopped the car. It was smaller than he remembered. Or maybe he was just bigger now in all the ways that mattered. More years, more weight, more things he'd seen that couldn't be unseen. The cabin sat low against the hillside like it had grown there. The boards dark with weather, the porch roof sagging on one side where a post had given way. A window on the west wall was covered with a piece of plywood someone had nailed from the outside. The grass around it had died and come back in uneven patches, and a blue plastic tarp lay crumpled near the woodpile, the kind that's supposed to be temporary and becomes permanent. Earl sat there for a moment with the engine idling. Then he said, out loud, to no one in particular, "Well, here we are." Cooper made a sound low in his throat, something between a groan and an agreement, and Earl put the truck in park. The door stuck. He had to lean his full shoulder into it and push twice before it gave with a sound like a sigh. Inside, the air was cold and stale and close, the way old spaces smell when they've been left to themselves for too long. Not quite rot, not quite mold, but something in between. Dust lay on every flat surface. A coffee mug sat on the kitchen table as though Bernard had set it down and simply never returned, which, Earl supposed, was more or less what had happened. He stood in the doorway and looked at it all. One main room, a kitchen against the far wall with a propane stove, and a row of cabinets that had swollen shut with humidity. A wood stove in the corner, black iron, with a box of birch rounds beside it. A narrow hallway leading to a single bedroom and a bathroom with a composting toilet, and a shower that used rainwater collected from the roof. A folding table near the window. 2 chairs. Not much, but it was something. And something, Earl Sutherland had recently learned, was a great deal more than nothing. He carried in what he'd brought. 1 duffel bag, a box of dry goods from the co-op in Valley View, Cooper's food and water bowls, and his old sleeping bag from his army days, still in its compression sack after all this time. He found birch bark and some dry kindling in the box beside the wood stove, and got a fire going on the third try. He sat on the floor with his back against the stove, while the heat slowly bled into the room, and Cooper lay down beside him, one paw on Earl's boot. Outside, the wind pushed through the spruce in long, slow waves. He had no cell service. He didn't particularly mind. The first week was the hardest, not because of the work, though there was plenty of it, but because of the silence. Not the outdoor silence which was full and inhabited, and which Earl had always found easier to be in than noise. The indoor silence, the kind that pressed in around you when you woke at 3 in the morning, and the fire had gone low, and there was no sound from the other side of the bed, no presence, no weight, nothing. He'd been with Renata since he was 22 years old. He'd come back from his first tour to find her standing at the gate at CFB Edmonton with her hair down, wearing a green jacket he'd never seen before, and something had just settled. The way things settle when you find the right fit without having looked for it. He hadn't known for a long time how wrong it had gone. Or maybe he had known and had been busy enough, tired enough, proud enough to look away. She had taken what she could legally take, and a few things beyond that, and her lawyer had been better than his, and Earl had made the mistake of trusting that fair meant something in a courtroom. It didn't, always. He thought about this in the early mornings, feeding wood into the stove, listening to Cooper breathe. He thought about the savings account she'd drained 8 months before filing. The one his own lawyer had flagged too late. He thought about the house in Spruce Grove, with the maple tree in the backyard that he'd planted from a sapling the year they'd moved in. He thought about a lot of things in those first weeks, and then, slowly, he started thinking about them less. Cooper helped with that. The dog needed feeding and walking and working, and Earl had always believed that dogs like Cooper, working dogs, service dogs, dogs bred and trained for purpose, they suffered when they had nothing to do. So he gave the dog things to do. He ran him through old obedience drills in the clearing behind the cabin. He threw sticks into the creek that cut through the south corner of the property, and let Cooper retrieve them until both of them were tired. He trained him on scent work using old socks stuffed into hollow logs, the way his handler instructor at Wainwright had taught him years ago. It kept them both sane. It was on a Thursday morning in the second week. Earl was almost certain it was Thursday. He'd been keeping track loosely in a notebook when Cooper started behaving strangely. They had been walking the property line, or what Earl estimated was the property line based on a hand-drawn map he'd found in Bernard's desk drawer. The south end of the 12 acres backed up against a low ridge of rock and secondary growth, spruce and poplar, with a few birch stands that had gone silver and bare. Earl was looking at the trees, thinking vaguely about firewood, when he noticed Cooper had stopped. The dog was standing about 10 meters ahead of him, head down, nose working the ground in fast, tight circles the way he did when he'd found a scent worth investigating. His tail was up. His ears were flat in the focused, intent way that meant he wasn't spooked. He was working. "What is it?" Earl said. Cooper moved forward a few meters, then stopped again, looked back, then moved forward again. Earl had spent 8 years learning to trust that look. He followed. Cooper led him off the rough path and into the secondary growth, through a stand of young poplar that thinned out against the base of the rock ridge. The ground here was uneven. Chunks of limestone broke through the surface at irregular angles, and the soil between them was dark and damp. Cooper stopped at the base of a large rock formation, maybe the height of a man, with a thick growth of old spruce crowding up against its south face. The dog sat down and looked at Earl. "Right here?" Earl said. Cooper didn't move. Earl crouched and looked at the base of the rock. The spruce branches came all the way to the ground on the south side, thick enough that you'd have to push through them to see anything. He looked at Cooper once more. The dog was still sitting, still watching him with that particular steadiness. And then he pushed the branches aside. There was a door, not a large door. About the size of a root cellar entrance. Heavy wood, reinforced with what looked like flat iron bars bolted across it in a cross pattern, mounted in a frame that had been set directly into the base of the rock. There was no handle on the outside, but there was an iron ring, old and dark with rust, driven through the wood just above center. Earl sat back on his heels and stared at it. He looked at Cooper. "How long have you known about this?" he said. It took him the better part of an hour to get the door open. It was not locked. He discovered this when he pulled on the iron ring and felt the resistance give slightly, the sound of something long stuck beginning to loosen. He went back to the cabin for tools, a pry bar, a hammer, a can of WD-40 he found under the kitchen sink. He sprayed the hinges liberally and left it for 20 minutes while he ate lunch, because he was 64 years old and he had learned not to rush things he couldn't undo. When he came back and worked the pry bar into the frame and pulled, the door swung open with a long, grinding complaint. Cold air breathed out from the darkness inside, colder than the outdoor air, cellar cold, the kind that stores itself underground through all seasons. Earl shone his flashlight in. Stone steps, 8 of them, leading down to a flat floor. The space below was larger than he'd expected, maybe 5 meters wide and 4 deep, with walls of raw stone and poured concrete patching. The ceiling was low, just enough to stand in, and it was full, not cluttered, organized. The kind of organized that takes patience and planning, and someone who expected to be gone for a long time. There were shelves along both walls, built from dimensional lumber, solid and well-joined. On the shelves, sealed tin containers labeled in Bernard's blocky handwriting: rice, lentils, dried beans, flour, oats, canned goods in cases stacked carefully. A row of 2-liter water jugs sealed. A Coleman lantern, fuel beside it. Hand tools hanging from a pegboard axe, a small bow saw, a draw knife, a hand plane. A canvas roll of wood chisels. 2 wool blankets in vacuum bags. A first aid kit in a green metal box, the old military kind. Against the back wall, a wooden chest, flat-lidded, with a latch but no lock. Earl stood at the bottom of the steps for a long moment, the flash moving slowly across the room. Cooper had come down behind him and was moving in measured, interested circles, nose down, reading the space. Earl went to the chest and opened it. Inside, a canvas pouch containing a roll of bills, Canadian, held with a rubber band. He didn't count them yet. A smaller envelope with his name written on the front in the same blocky handwriting as the tin labels. A leather-bound journal with a brass clasp, and under all of it, wrapped in oilcloth, a framed photograph. He picked up the photograph first. It was his uncle Bernard, younger than Earl had ever known him, standing in front of this same cabin. Beside him stood a boy. Earl recognized the shirt before he recognized the face. It was him, the summer he'd been 11 or 12. He remembered that shirt. His mother had bought it at Zeller's. He stood there holding the photograph for a very long time. Cooper came and stood beside him. He opened the envelope last, sitting on the bottom step with the lantern lit. And Cooper across his knees, which was not a comfortable arrangement for a man of his frame, but neither of them had suggested otherwise. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten, dated the previous August, 4 months before Bernard died. "Earl," it began. "Not dear Earl, just Earl." Which was very Bernard. "If you're reading this, you found the door. I figured Cooper would find it before you did. Dogs always know. I asked around about him when you were stationed at Cold Lake. Good dog, people said. I trust people less than dogs, but that's been working out fine for me. I didn't leave a will because I don't trust lawyers, and I don't trust the government, and I trust the land registry office in Peace River even less. What I trust is blood. You're the only Sutherland left who I'd want to have this place, and if you're reading this, you're probably in some kind of trouble, because that's the only reason a Sutherland comes home. The chest has what you need to get started. The land is worth more than it looks. There's a survey map in the journal, pages 41 to 43. The east boundary runs along the second creek, not the first. The county has it wrong on their maps, and I never bothered to correct them because I didn't want the attention. That land is yours too. Get it registered properly. The supplies will last you a year if you're careful. I was careful. I expect you know how to be. I wasn't always good at keeping in touch. I know that. I should have written more. But I thought about you. I thought about you a lot. Especially after I heard what happened with the service and the discharge and all of it. You didn't deserve that. Good men rarely do. The cabin is yours. The land is yours. Build something. Bernard Earl folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. He sat there with the lantern burning and Cooper's weight across his lap and the cold stone smell of the cellar all around him. And this time, finally, the tears came. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the quiet kind that come when there's no one watching and something long held has finally been set down. He let it happen. After a while, he wiped his face with the back of his hand and scratched Cooper behind the ear and said, "Well, okay then." He spent the next 3 weeks taking inventory. The east boundary, when he walked it, was indeed further than the county map showed. Nearly 2 additional acres of good timber and a stretch of the second creek with clean running water. He photographed the original survey markers with his phone, charged from the truck, and drove into Valley View to find a signal strong enough to email the photos to a land surveyor in Grande Prairie, who confirmed what Bernard had written. Getting it registered properly took 6 weeks and cost him $340, which he paid from the roll of bills in the canvas pouch. He counted the bills eventually. They came to $11,400. Not a fortune, but more than he'd had in any account he currently held. He began fixing the cabin. He reseated the porch post that had given way and replaced the plywood on the west window. With salvage glass he found in the woodshed, he repointed the stone on the chimney base with mortar. He mixed in an old trough. He cleared the gutters and repaired the section of roof over the bedroom that had started to lift in one corner. Working slowly, carefully, the way the army had taught him. Methodically, without wasted motion. The mornings were cold still, but the afternoons were warming. Cooper ran the property like it was his job, which in a certain sense it was. Checking the perimeter, investigating the creek, chasing the ground squirrels that had taken up residence in the woodpile, with enormous enthusiasm and no success. Earl started sleeping through the night, not immediately, but by the 5th week, mostly. He started writing in the evenings, sitting at the folding table near the window, with Bernard's lantern and a spiral notebook he'd bought at the co-op. Nothing formal, just what had happened each day. How much wood he'd split, what he'd seen on the creek, what Cooper had done that had made him laugh. And there were several things each day that made him laugh. Because that was the character of that dog. He hadn't written regularly since his earliest deployments, when he'd kept journals that he'd later burned, because they contained things he didn't want to carry and didn't want to leave behind. This writing was different, quieter, less like recording and more like thinking out loud. It helped. Before we continue, if you're watching this from somewhere in Canada or anywhere in the world, tell me in the comments. Where are you right now? It was early June when Nadine showed up. Earl was splitting wood in the side yard when he heard the sound of a vehicle on the gravel road. Unusual enough that Cooper came off the porch at a run, ears up, positioning himself between Earl and the sound. Earl set the axe in the chopping block and waited. The car that appeared around the bend was a silver sedan, cautious on. It stopped about 20 meters out and sat there for a moment before the door opened. Nadine was 58. She walked with a slight tilt to the left, that Earl knew was from an old workplace injury, and she was wearing the same kind of practical outdoor jacket she'd always worn. The green canvas one with the 4 front pockets. She'd been Renata's sister. She still was, technically, though Earl suspected they hadn't spoken much after the divorce. She'd sent him a text 2 weeks after the papers were signed that said only, "I'm sorry, Earl, that wasn't right." He'd never responded, not because he didn't appreciate it, but because he hadn't known what to say. She stopped about 5 meters from him. Cooper was watching her carefully. "He won't bite," Earl said, "unless I tell him to." "I know," Nadine said. "I just didn't want to startle him." She looked around at the cabin, the cleared yard, the new glass in the west window. You've been busy. Nothing else to do. Renata knows you're here, she said. I thought you should know. Earl picked up the axe and set another round on the block. All right. She's been talking to someone. About the property. She seems to think that if you built something here, something of value, she might have a claim on the improvements. Earl brought the axe down. He set the two pieces aside and placed another round. And what does her someone say? I don't know exactly, but I thought you should hear it. He brought the axe down again. The wood split cleanly, the way good dry birch does. Nadine, he said, without looking up. The land was transferred to me by estate, not purchased during the marriage. It was never marital property. Her lawyer can look into it all he wants. He could feel her watching him. I spoke to someone before I came up here, he said. A property lawyer in Edmonton. Cost me $200 for an hour. Best $200 I've spent in years. He set the axe in the block and looked at her. I'm not easy to catch off guard twice. She nodded slowly. Something in her face relaxed. I also wanted to ask, she said carefully, how you were doing. Earl looked at Cooper, who was now sitting at Nadine's feet, tail moving slowly. Traitor, Earl thought, not without affection. Better, he said. Actually better. She stayed for coffee, which was the first time Earl had made coffee for another person in 11 weeks, and it tasted different in a way that surprised him. Richer, somehow, or maybe just more itself. They sat on the porch in the old wooden chairs he'd found in the shed and sanded down, and she asked questions about the cabin and the land, and what he was planning to do, and he answered them honestly and without drama, which was also something that felt different and better. When she left, she said she might come back in the fall. He said she was welcome to. After her car disappeared down the gravel road, Cooper jumped up and put both paws on Earl's chest, which was a thing the dog was not supposed to do and did anyway. At moments, he apparently judged to warrant it. All right, Earl said, holding the dog's face in both hands, looking into the amber eyes that had been looking back at him through everything. The discharge, the divorce, the parking lot on Renfrew Street, the long drive north, all of it. All right. The summer came in properly after that. The aspens on the north side of the property leafed out in a green so pale it was almost silver, and the creek ran clear and cold over the limestone shelf below the ridge. Earl fixed the woodshed roof and built a new gate for the property entrance, with lumber he milled from 2 poplar that had fallen across the driveway in a spring windstorm. He extended the garden bed Bernard had started years ago and neglected, turning the soil and working in compost from the bin he'd started in May, planting potatoes and kale and bush beans from seed packets he'd bought in Valley View. He wasn't turning into a farmer, he knew that, but there was something in the work, in the specificity of it, the realness of it, that he needed right now. Every fixed board, every cleared furrow, every cord of wood stacked in the shed was an argument against the feeling that things could not be rebuilt. He was making the argument every day, and gradually beginning to believe it himself. Cooper was 8 years old, and Belgian Malinois don't get old gently. There was stiffness in his hips some mornings now, especially after cold nights, and Earl had started lifting him into the truck rather than letting him jump. He'd driven to Grande Prairie to see a veterinarian who'd examined Cooper thoroughly and said he was in excellent shape for his age and his history, and prescribed a joint supplement and recommended hydrotherapy if Earl could manage it, which he couldn't easily, but he found a woman in Valley View who ran a dog massage therapy practice out of her garage and drove Cooper in twice a month because the dog deserved it, and because watching Cooper walk out of that garage, moving better than he'd walked in, was one of the best things in Earl's current life. He'd stopped measuring his life in what had been taken. He was starting to measure it in what was here. In August, he drove into Grande Prairie to deal with some paperwork, and while he was there, he stopped at the Royal Canadian Legion branch on the west side of town. He hadn't been to a legion in years, not because he didn't value it, but because he'd been the kind of veteran who processed things privately, by which he meant incompletely, by which he meant badly. He sat at the bar and ordered a coffee and ended up talking for 2 hours with a man named… Well, it didn't matter what his name was. What mattered was that he'd served in Bosnia and later in Kandahar, and had a yellow lab at his feet, and spoke with the particular economy of someone who knew exactly what words were worth and didn't waste them. They didn't say anything profound. They talked about firewood and truck engines and dogs, about the way northern Alberta looks in the last week of August, when the light goes gold and horizontal, and the birch start to think about turning. Earl drove home along the highway in the early evening, with the windows down, and Cooper's head out the back, and thought that he had not felt this approximate to something like himself in a very long time. He pulled onto the gravel road and around the long bend, and the cabin came into view with the porch light he'd repaired, burning yellow against the dusky tree line, and something in his chest settled in a way it had been unsettled. For so long he'd forgotten it could be otherwise. He got out and walked to the porch and sat in one of the wooden chairs, and Cooper came and lay down across his feet, which was unnecessary and heavy and exactly right, and the spruce trees moved in the evening wind, and Earl Sutherland sat in the quiet he had earned and let it be enough. It was enough. It was more than enough. It had taken a Belgian Malinois with a scarred eye and a nose that knew things before he did, and a dead uncle who'd written a letter in August knowing he wouldn't see November, and a door hidden in a rock face at the back of 12 acres in northern Alberta, and the long drive north with nothing but a duffel bag and a dog and whatever that smell in the truck had been. Maybe grief, maybe relief, maybe just the particular smell of a life being quietly and stubbornly restarted. Whatever it was, Cooper had known where to go. He always had.